The barn door hadn't been opened in 43 years, but Detective Sarah Chen could smell the decay seeping through the weathered wood planks, even before the crowbar bit into the rusted hasp. October wind carried the scent of dying corn across the Lancaster County fields, mixing with something else, something that made her stomach clench with a familiar dread she'd learned to recognize after 15 years working cold cases. The Stoltzfus farm had been abandoned since 1981. The year 3 Amish children walked into Miller's Hollow schoolhouse one September morning and never walked out. Sarah's breath came in visible puffs as she watched the county maintenance crew work. The barn sat 2 miles from the one-room schoolhouse where Rebecca Yoder, age 7, Samuel Byler, age 9, and little Mary Lapp, just 6 years old, had vanished without a trace on September 15, 1981. The case had haunted Lancaster County for over 4 decades, becoming the kind of story that parents whispered about when children stayed out too late, the kind that made even hardened detectives pause when they saw school buses on country roads. "You sure about this, Chin?" asked Detective Mike Brennan, her partner for the past 8 years. His Irish accent had softened since moving from Philadelphia, but stress always brought it back. "Anonymous tip could be from anyone. Could be some kid playing pranks." Sarah pulled the typed letter from her jacket pocket, the paper protected in a clear evidence bag. Block letters, no signature, postmarked from Lancaster 3 days ago. "The children are in Stoltzfus barn. Look for the buggy. Truth needs to come out before I die." The handwriting analysis had come back inconclusive, but something about the desperate scrawl in the final sentence made Sarah's chest tighten. The crowbar snapped the lock with a metallic screech that sent a flock of starlings exploding from the barn's peaked roof. Sarah stepped forward as the door swung open, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light filtering through gaps in the siding, and she could hear the scrabbling of small creatures in the hay bales stacked against the far wall. Then she saw it. The horse buggy sat in the center of the barn floor like a monument to tragedy, its black paint dulled by decades of dust but otherwise preserved in the dry air. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached, her flashlight revealing details that made her mouth go dry. The buggy's door hung open, and there, on the worn leather seat, lay 3 small lunch pails, their contents long since turned to dust and decay. "Jesus Christ," Mike breathed behind her. "Is that—" "The Yoder girls," Sarah whispered, reading the hand-painted name on the smallest pail. "Rebecca." Her voice cracked on the name. She'd studied the missing children's photographs so many times that their faces had become seared into her memory. Rebecca with her bright eyes and gap-toothed smile, Samuel with his serious expression and carefully combed hair, Mary clutching a faceless doll in the only photograph her parents had allowed to be taken. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone to call the county coroner. The barn felt like a tomb, and she had the overwhelming sense that they were about to disturb something that had been sleeping for far too long. The anonymous letter was right about one thing. The truth was here, waiting in the shadows and dust of the Stoltzfus farm. The investigation into the disappearance of the 3 Amish children had consumed the Lancaster County Sheriff's Department for months in 1981. Sarah had read every file, every witness statement, every dead-end lead that had driven the original investigators to distraction. The children had been seen entering the Miller's Hollow schoolhouse at 7:30 a.m. on September 15th, their lunch pails swinging at their sides as they walked up the gravel path. Their teacher, Martha Hostetter, had marked them present for morning prayers. But when Martha rang the bell for lunch at noon, only 22 children answered. Rebecca, Samuel, and Mary were gone, their wooden desks empty, their morning lessons left unfinished. No one had seen them leave, no one had heard them cry out. They had simply vanished like morning mist, leaving behind only the kind of questions that eat at a community's soul. The original investigation had been hampered by the Amish community's reluctance to involve outsiders in their affairs. Detective William Kowalski, who had led the case in 1981, had struggled to navigate the cultural barriers that separated the plain people from the English world. Sarah had interviewed Kowalski 3 years ago, before his death from lung cancer, and the old detective's eyes had still held the haunted look of a man who had failed to bring children home. They were good people, Kowalski had told her, his voice rough from chemotherapy. But they had their own ways of handling things. Didn't trust the system, didn't want their children's faces on milk cartons. made it damn near impossible to get the word out. He'd paused, staring out the window of his hospice room. I used to dream about those kids. Still do sometimes. Wonder what happened to them in that last hour. Now, standing in the Stoltzfus barn with the county coroner's van pulling up outside, Sarah felt the weight of those 4 decades pressing down on her shoulders. The crime scene photographers were already setting up their equipment, their camera flashes illuminating the buggy in stark bursts of light. Every detail had to be documented, every piece of evidence carefully cataloged before they could begin to understand what had really happened on that September morning. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the county coroner, emerged from the van carrying her field kit. Sarah had worked with Pat on dozens of cases over the years, and she could read the older woman's expression like a book. The tight line of her mouth, the way her shoulders squared as she approached the barn. Pat was preparing herself for something awful. "What do we have?" Pat asked, pulling on latex gloves. 3 lunch pails, positioned like they were placed deliberately, Sarah said, leading her toward the buggy. "Anonymous tip led us here. The timing matches the 1981 disappearance." Pat's examination was methodical and thorough. She photographed the lunch pails from every angle, noted their position relative to the buggy, and carefully lifted each one with tweezers. The Rebecca Yoder pail contained the desiccated remains of what might have been a sandwich and an apple core. Samuel Byler's held crumbs, and a small wooden toy horse. Mary Lapp's was nearly empty except for a few crushed crackers, and something that made Pat's breath catch. "Sarah," Pat said quietly, "look at this." Wrapped in a piece of faded blue cloth at the bottom of Mary's lunch pail was a small bone. Not human, too small, too delicate, but carved into its surface with a sharp instrument was a single word, H-E-Elp. The discovery sent ripples of shock through the investigation team. Sarah bagged the bone carefully, her mind racing through the implications. Someone had taken the time to carve that desperate plea into what appeared to be a bird bone, then hidden it in a 6-year-old's lunch pail. The level of planning suggested this wasn't a crime of opportunity, but something carefully orchestrated. "Run everything through the lab," Sarah instructed the evidence technician. "DNA, fingerprints, fiber analysis. I want to know what these children touched last." As the sun began to set over Lancaster County, casting long shadows across the abandoned farm, Sarah found herself standing alone in the barn, staring at the empty space where the buggy had been. The vehicle had been loaded onto a flatbed truck and taken to the county evidence facility, but its ghost seemed to linger in the dusty air. The anonymous letter had said the truth needed to come out before someone died. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed the number for the Lancaster County Clerk's office. If someone was dying, if someone was finally ready to talk, she needed to find them before it was too late. The next morning brought rain, the kind of steady downpour that turned dirt roads to mud and made the world feel smaller, more enclosed. Sarah sat in her office at the county sheriff's department, surrounded by boxes of files from the original investigation. The coffee in her mug had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed. Her attention was focused on a photograph taken at the Miller's Hollow Schoolhouse on September 16, 1981, the day after the children vanished. The image showed the one-room schoolhouse with its simple wooden desks arranged in neat rows. But what caught Sarah's eye was something the original investigators had missed. In the background, barely visible through the school's window, was the outline of a horse buggy, the same buggy they'd found in the Stoltzfus barn. Sarah reached for her phone and dialed the number for the Lancaster Historical Society. If she was going to understand what had happened to those children, she needed to know more about the Stoltzfus family and why their farm had been abandoned so suddenly in 1981. Margaret Thornton, the society's director, had a voice like autumn leaves, dry and rustling with age, but still strong. "The Stoltzfus farm," she said thoughtfully when Sarah explained her request. "That's a name I haven't heard in years. Eli Stoltzfus and his family left Lancaster County right after those children went missing, sold the farm to the bank for a fraction of its value, and moved to Ohio, I believe." "Do you remember anything unusual about the timing?" Sarah asked, making notes on a legal pad. "Well, now that you mention it, yes." The Stoltzfus family had been part of the Miller's Hollow community for generations. Eli's father built that barn with his own hands in 1923. It was strange that they would just up and leave like that, especially right after such a tragedy struck the community. Sarah felt a familiar tingling in her chest, the sensation she'd learned to recognize as the first stirring of a breakthrough. "Mrs. Thornton, do you have any records of where the Stoltzfus family went? Any forwarding addresses or family connections? I might have something in the archives. Give me a day or two to look through the old membership rolls. The Amish keep good records, even if they don't always share them with outsiders." After ending the call, Sarah leaned back in her chair and stared at the whiteboard she'd covered, with names, dates, and connections. The timeline was becoming clearer, but questions multiplied with each new piece of information. Why had the Stoltzfus family fled Lancaster County so suddenly? How had the children's lunch pails ended up in their barn? And who had sent the anonymous letter that led to the discovery? The lab results arrived that afternoon, delivered by a technician who looked like he'd seen a ghost. Sarah tore open the envelope with shaking hands, already knowing that whatever was inside would change everything. The DNA analysis on the carved bone had yielded partial results, enough to confirm that it had been handled by a child, but not enough to make a positive identification. More disturbing was the forensic pathologist's report on the bone itself. It was from a mourning dove, and the carving had been done with a sharp instrument, possibly a small knife or awl. The word HELP had been carved repeatedly, the letters growing more frantic with each iteration, as if the child had been running out of time. But it was the fiber analysis that made Sarah's hands tremble as she read. Cotton fibers found in Rebecca Yoder's lunch pail matched samples from clothing worn by Amish children in the 1980s. More specifically, they matched the blue dress Rebecca had been wearing on the day she disappeared. The children had been in that barn. The question was whether they'd left it alive. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Margaret Thornton's number. "I found something," the older woman said without preamble. Eli Stoltzfus had a son, Jonas, who would have been about 16 in 1981. The boy had some troubles, what we might call learning disabilities today, but back then people weren't so understanding. He was known to spend a lot of time alone, wandering the fields and woods around Miller's Hollow. "Is Jonas still alive?" "That's just it. I don't know. The family records show he never married, never had children of his own. He might have stayed in Ohio with his parents, or he might have moved on. But there's something else, Detective. I found a letter in the church archives, dated October 1981. It was from Jonas to his bishop, asking for forgiveness for something he'd done. The letter was never sent." Sarah's pulse quickened. What did it say? That's where it gets interesting. The letter is mostly illegible, water-damaged, I think, but I can make out a few words. Children, scared, didn't mean, and at the bottom, clear as day, I'm sorry. The pieces were falling into place, but Sarah knew she needed more than fragments of old letters and circumstantial evidence. She needed to find Jonas Stoltzfus and hear his story, whatever it might be. The anonymous letter had been right. Someone was dying, and they wanted the truth to come out before it was too late. Sarah spent the next 3 days tracking down leads in Ohio, making calls to Amish communities in Holmes County and surrounding areas. The plain people were polite but guarded, reluctant to discuss members of their community with an outsider. But gradually, Sarah began to piece together the story of Jonas Stoltzfus's life after leaving Lancaster County. He had never fully integrated into the Ohio community, several sources told her. He'd lived on the edges of Amish society, working odd jobs and struggling with what one elderly bishop described as a troubled spirit. Jonas had been known to talk to himself, to disappear for days at a time, and to show up at church services with dirt under his fingernails and a wild look in his eyes. He was never quite right after his family left Pennsylvania, said David Yoder, no relation to the missing Rebecca who had known Jonas in Ohio. Something had happened to him. Something that changed him. He'd wake up screaming in the night, calling out children's names. His parents tried to help him, but there was only so much they could do. The trail led Sarah to a small town called Charm, Ohio, where Jonas had lived alone in a one-room house on the outskirts of the community. The house had been abandoned for 5 years, neighbors told her, ever since Jonas had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and moved to a care facility in nearby Millersburg. Sunset Manor was a small, privately run facility that specialized in caring for Amish patients who couldn't be treated at home. Sarah arrived on a Thursday afternoon, her hands sweating despite the cool October air. The director, a gentlewoman named Ruth Beachy, led her through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and old wood. "Jonas is in the final stages," Ruth explained quietly. "He's been asking for someone to talk to, someone who would listen to his story. We thought he meant a family member, but perhaps he meant you." The room was small and simple, furnished with a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a single window that looked out onto fields of harvested corn. Jonas Stoltzfus lay propped up on pillows, his face gaunt but his eyes startlingly alert. At 63, he looked much older, his body ravaged by cancer and decades of guilt. "You're the detective," he said in a voice like rustling leaves. "I've been waiting for you." Sarah pulled the wooden chair close to his bed and sat down, her recorder ready but hidden from view. "Jonas, I need to ask you about September 15th, 1981. About the day 3 children disappeared from Miller's Hollow." His eyes closed, and for a moment Sarah thought he might not answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "I was 16, old enough to know better, but not old enough to understand what I was doing." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I had been watching the school, watching the children come and go. Not in a bad way, you understand. I like to watch them play, to see them happy. I never had friends my own age. Other children were afraid of me." Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What happened that morning, Jonas?" "I was in the woods behind the schoolhouse. I had found a family of doves nesting in a dead tree, and I was watching them. The children came out for their morning break, and I saw Rebecca, Samuel, and Mary walking toward the woods. They were looking for something, a ball, I think, that had rolled away from their game." Jonas paused, his breathing labored. Sarah waited, knowing that pushing too hard might cause him to withdraw. "I wanted to help them find it. I wanted to be part of their game, just once. So I came out of the woods, and I called to them. But when they saw me, they got scared. Rebecca started to cry, and Samuel told her to run. But Mary was always the brave one. She asked me what I wanted." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I wanted to help. I told her I wasn't going to hurt them. But they were still afraid, and they started to run back toward the school. I panicked. I thought they would tell their teacher, and she would tell my father, and he would be angry with me again. So I followed them." Jonas's voice broke, and Sarah had to strain to hear his next words. "I had the buggy in the woods. I used it sometimes to collect firewood, to help my father with farm work. I thought maybe if I could talk to them, if I could explain, they would understand. So I asked them to come with me, just for a little while. I promised I would take them back to school." "And they came with you?" "They were scared, but they came. I think they thought I would hurt them if they didn't. That wasn't what I wanted, but that's what happened. I drove them to our farm, to the barn, and I tried to explain that I just wanted to be their friend. But they were crying and they kept asking to go back to school." Sarah's mouth was dry, but she forced herself to keep asking questions. "What happened next, Jonas?" "I told them they could go back soon, but first they had to promise not to tell anyone they had seen me. I knew my father would be angry if he found out I had taken them. So I locked them in the barn. Just for a little while, I told myself. Just until I could figure out what to do." The room fell silent except for the sound of Jonas's labored breathing. Sarah could feel the weight of 43 years pressing down on both of them. All the lives that had been changed by the decisions of a troubled 16-year-old boy. "I brought them food," Jonas continued. "Their lunch pails from school. I had picked them up when I saw them scattered in the woods. I thought maybe if they ate something they would feel better. But they were too scared to eat much." "How long did you keep them there?" 2 days. 2 days and 2 nights. I wanted to let them go, but I was terrified. I knew I would be in trouble, not just with my father, but with the law. I had heard stories about what happened to people who took children. I thought maybe if I waited long enough, everyone would forget about them. Sarah's hands were shaking as she wrote notes, but she kept her voice steady. "What happened on the 3rd day?" Jonas turned his face toward the window, staring out at the fields. They were getting sick. Mary had stopped eating altogether, and Rebecca had developed a fever. Samuel kept asking about his mother, kept saying she would be worried. I realized I had to do something. I couldn't keep them forever. So you let them go? I tried to. I went to the barn that morning to tell them I would take them home. But when I opened the door... His voice trailed off, and Sarah saw tears running down his cheeks. What did you see, Jonas? Mary was lying on the floor. She wasn't moving. Rebecca was trying to wake her up, shaking her and calling her name. Samuel was huddled in the corner, shivering. The barn had gotten cold during the night, and they didn't have warm enough clothes. Sarah's chest tightened. Was Mary? She was dead. I think it was her heart. She had been born with something wrong, something that made her weak. The fear, the cold, the stress of being taken. It was too much for her little body. The room fell silent again, and Sarah had to fight back tears of her own. She had spent years imagining what had happened to the 3 children, but the reality was somehow both better and worse than she had feared. What did you do then? I panicked. I had never seen a dead person before, and I didn't know what to do. Rebecca and Samuel were crying, and I was crying, and I lost my mind. I told them we had to bury Mary, that we couldn't let anyone find her. I made them help me dig a grave in the woods behind the barn. And then? I knew I had to let Rebecca and Samuel go, but I was terrified they would tell someone what had happened. I made them promise to keep it secret, told them that if anyone found out, I would be in terrible trouble. They were so scared, so traumatized, that they agreed to anything I said. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind reeling. You let them go? I drove them to the edge of Miller's Hollow in the buggy and let them walk home. I told them to say they had been lost in the woods, that they couldn't remember what had happened. I thought maybe people would believe them, maybe the whole thing would just go away. But it didn't go away. No. Rebecca and Samuel tried to keep the secret, but they were just children. They couldn't handle what they had seen, what they had been through. Rebecca started having nightmares, and Samuel stopped speaking altogether. Their parents knew something terrible had happened, but they couldn't get the truth out of them. Jonas paused, his breathing becoming more labored. Sarah could see that the effort of telling his story was exhausting him, but she needed to hear the rest. Within a week, both children had complete nervous breakdowns. Rebecca was found wandering the fields at night, calling Mary's name. Samuel had to be physically restrained to keep him from running away. Their parents finally took them to a doctor in Lancaster, and eventually the truth came out. They told the doctor what had happened. Fragments of it. Enough for the families to understand that someone had taken them, that Mary was dead, that they had been forced to help bury her. But the children couldn't identify me specifically. They were too traumatized, too confused. They just kept talking about the scary man who had hurt Mary. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What happened to Rebecca and Samuel? Their families did what they thought was best. They took the children out of the community, sent them to live with relatives in other states. The idea was that a change of scenery, a new start, might help them heal. But I don't think they ever really got over it. And you? What happened to you? Jonas closed his eyes, his face contorting with pain that seemed to come from deeper than his cancer. I lived with the guilt every day. I watched the search parties comb the woods, watched the sheriff's deputies question everyone in the community. I knew I should confess, but I was too afraid. My father sensed something was wrong, but he never asked directly. It wasn't the Amish way. Why did your family leave Lancaster County? My father made the decision after a month of investigation. He said the community was too damaged, too suspicious. Everyone was looking at everyone else, wondering who could have done such a thing. He thought a fresh start would be better for all of us. Sarah looked at the man lying in the hospital bed, seeing both the frightened 16-year-old he had been and the broken 63-year-old he had become. Jonas, where did you bury Mary? In the woods behind the barn. There's a big oak tree with a lightning scar running down its trunk. She's buried 20 feet east of that tree, in a grave we dug with our bare hands. I marked it with a circle of stones, but after all these years, the stones might still be there. I go back sometimes in my dreams. I see her there, still 6 years old, still asking me why I took her away from her family. I try to tell her I'm sorry, but she just looks at me with those sad eyes and asks when she can go home. Sarah reached out and took Jonas's hand in hers. His skin felt like paper, fragile and cold. Jonas, I need to ask you something important. Did you send me a letter? An anonymous letter telling me to look in the barn? He squeezed her hand weakly. I've been writing letters for years, but I never sent them. I was too afraid, even after my parents died. But when the doctors told me I had maybe a month left, I knew I couldn't take the secret with me. Those children deserve to have their story told. So you did send the letter? I had a friend mail it for me, someone who comes to visit the patients here. I didn't tell them what it was about, just asked them to post it to the Lancaster County Sheriff's Department. I've been waiting for someone to come, hoping it wouldn't be too late. Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks. It's not too late, Jonas. We're going to find Mary and bring her home to her family. We're going to tell the truth about what happened. Will you tell them I'm sorry? Will you tell them I never meant for any of this to happen? I will. But Jonas, I need you to know something. Rebecca and Samuel, they're still alive. They're in their 50s now, and they have families of their own. They never forgot Mary, and they never forgot you. I think they would want to know that you're sorry, that you've carried this guilt all these years. Jonas closed his eyes, and Sarah could see the exhaustion settling over him like a blanket. I would like that. I would like to tell them myself if I can. Sarah stayed with Jonas for another hour, recording his complete confession and asking the questions that would help her build a case. Not for prosecution. Jonas would be dead long before any trial could take place, but for closure. For the families who had spent 43 years not knowing what had happened to their children. As she prepared to leave, Jonas spoke one last time. Detective, there's something else. In the barn, under the floorboards near where the buggy was parked, I hid something there, something that belongs to Mary, her doll, the one she was carrying when I took them. I thought maybe someday someone would find it and know the truth. Sarah squeezed his hand one more time. We'll find it, Jonas. We'll find everything. The search for Mary Lapp's remains began the next morning, a crisp October day that painted the Pennsylvania countryside in shades of gold and scarlet. Sarah stood in the woods behind the abandoned Stoltzfus barn, watching the cadaver dog work its way through the underbrush. The lightning-scarred oak tree was exactly where Jonas had said it would be, its ancient trunk bearing the white scar like a marker pointing toward long-buried secrets. The dog, a German shepherd named Rex, suddenly stopped and sat beside a small clearing 20 feet east of the tree. His handler, a quiet woman named Carol Martinez, nodded to Sarah. He's got something. The excavation was slow and careful, conducted by a team of forensic anthropologists from the University of Pennsylvania. Sarah watched as they worked, their brushes and small tools gradually revealing what had been hidden for so long. The circle of stones was still there, weathered but intact, forming a rough boundary around a small grave. What they found confirmed Jonas's story in heartbreaking detail. The remains of a small child, perhaps 6 years old, wrapped in a piece of blue fabric that had once been a dress. The skeleton was intact, curled in a fetal position that suggested the child had been placed in the grave with care rather than simply dumped. Dr. Michael Harrison, the lead anthropologist, worked with the reverence of a priest conducting a funeral service. Preliminary examination suggests death by natural causes, he told Sarah quietly. Possibly cardiac arrest, consistent with the story you've told me. There's no evidence of trauma, no signs of violence. Near the child's hand, they found a small carved bone, a mourning dove's wishbone, with the word help scratched into its surface. The same type of bone they had found in the lunch pail, confirming that Mary had been the one who had left that desperate message. Sarah felt her throat tighten as she watched the remains being carefully lifted from the ground. This was someone's baby, someone's little girl, who had been missing for 43 years. The Lapp family had never stopped looking for her, never stopped hoping that somehow, somewhere, she might still be alive. The search of the barn that afternoon yielded the final piece of evidence Jonas had promised. Under the floorboards, wrapped in an oilcloth bundle, was a small rag doll with button eyes and yarn hair. The doll's dress was faded but intact, hand-sewn with the care that only a mother could provide. Sarah held the doll in her hands, imagining 6-year-old Mary clutching it as she walked to school that September morning, never knowing it would be the last time she would see her family. The doll would be returned to the Lapp family, along with their daughter's remains, finally bringing an end to 4 decades of uncertainty. But first, Sarah had one more task to complete. She needed to find Rebecca Yoder and Samuel Byler, the 2 survivors of Jonas Stoltzfus's desperate act. They deserved to know that their silence had finally been broken, that Mary's story would be told. The task of locating Rebecca and Samuel proved easier than Sarah had expected. The Amish community, despite its reputation for insularity, maintained careful records of its members' whereabouts. Both survivors had left Pennsylvania as children and had never returned, but they had stayed in touch with distant relatives who knew how to find them. Rebecca Yoder had become Rebecca Morrison, married to a Methodist minister in rural Kansas. She had raised 4 children of her own and worked as a teacher, dedicating her life to protecting the innocent in ways she hadn't been able to protect herself. Sarah reached her by phone on a Tuesday evening, her voice gentle but firm as she explained why she was calling. "I've been waiting for this call for 43 years, Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the tears Sarah could hear in it. "I knew someday the truth would come out. I just hoped I would live long enough to see it." Samuel Byler had taken a different path. He had left the Amish faith entirely, moved to Oregon, and become a carpenter. He had never married, never had children, and had struggled with depression and anxiety throughout his adult life. When Sarah called him, he was living alone in a small cabin in the Cascade Mountains, working on hand-carved furniture that he sold at local craft fairs. "I tried to forget," he told her, his voice rough with emotion. "I tried to pretend it never happened. But you can't forget something like that. It stays with you, colors everything you do. I've been in therapy for 30 years, and I still wake up sometimes thinking I'm back in that barn." Sarah arranged for both survivors to come to Pennsylvania, to meet with her and with Jonas if they chose to. The decision would be theirs, but she felt they deserved the opportunity to confront their past and perhaps find some measure of peace. Rebecca arrived first, flying in from Kansas on a Thursday morning. She was a small woman in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that held depths of sadness. She looked remarkably like the 7-year-old girl in the photographs from 1981, but her face bore the weight of decades spent carrying an unbearable secret. "I want to see him," she said simply when Sarah met her at the airport. "I want to look him in the eyes and tell him what he did to us." Samuel drove in from Oregon, arriving the next day in a battered pickup truck loaded with samples of his woodwork. He was tall and lean, with calloused hands and a beard that couldn't hide the scars around his mouth. Scars he had given himself as a child, Sarah realized, biting his lips until they bled rather than speak about what had happened. "I don't know if I can face him," Samuel admitted as they sat in Sarah's office. "Part of me wants to hurt him, to make him suffer the way we suffered. But another part of me just wants to understand why. Why did he do it? Why did he take us?" Sarah arranged for the meeting to take place at Sunset Manor, in a conference room that could accommodate the small group. She would be present, along with a counselor who specialized in trauma recovery, and a chaplain who could provide spiritual support if needed. Most importantly, a representative from the Lapp family would be there, Mary's younger sister, who had grown up in the shadow of her sister's disappearance. Anna Lapp was 47 years old, a mother of 6 and grandmother of 12. She had spent her entire life wondering what had happened to the big sister who had helped her tie her shoes and taught her to braid cornhusk dolls. The news of Mary's discovery had brought both relief and renewed grief to the Lapp family. "We always hoped she was still alive somewhere," Anna said, her voice heavy with emotion. "We prayed every day that she would come home. Finding out she died so young, so scared. It's hard to bear, but at least we know the truth now. At least we can lay her to rest properly." The meeting took place on a gray November afternoon, the kind of day that made indoor spaces feel warm and necessary. Jonas had been moved to a wheelchair for the occasion, his body too weak to support him for long periods. But his eyes were alert, and his hands steady as he prepared to face the consequences of his actions. Rebecca spoke first, her voice clear and strong despite the tears that flowed freely down her cheeks. "I need you to understand what you did to us. You didn't just take us for 3 days. You took our childhood, our innocence, our ability to trust. You made us accomplices in Mary's death, and that burden has shaped everything about our lives." Jonas listened without interruption, his own tears falling onto the blanket across his lap. When Rebecca finished, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I know. I've known every day for 43 years. I was a damaged boy who made a terrible choice, and I've spent my entire life paying for it. But I know that's not enough. Nothing I can say or do will ever be enough." Samuel's response was different, more raw and visceral. "You destroyed us," he said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "You took 3 innocent children, and you destroyed us. Mary died because of your selfishness, and Rebecca and I have been living with the consequences ever since. I've never had a normal relationship, never been able to trust anyone completely. Do you have any idea what that's like?" "I do," Jonas replied, "because I've lived the same way. I've been alone my entire life, afraid to get close to anyone because I knew what I was capable of. I've been punishing myself for what I did, but I know that doesn't matter to you. It shouldn't matter to you." Anna Lapp had remained silent throughout the confrontation, but now she spoke with the quiet dignity that Sarah had learned to associate with the Amish community. "I came here today because I needed to see the man who took my sister. I needed to understand how someone could do such a thing. I don't think I'll ever understand it, but I can see that you're suffering too. That doesn't excuse what you did, but it helps me to know that you've paid a price for it." The meeting lasted for 2 hours, filled with tears and recriminations and, gradually, a kind of exhausted peace. Jonas told his story in full, answering every question, accepting every condemnation. He spoke about his childhood, his struggles with what would now be recognized as autism spectrum disorder, his desperate need for connection that had led to such a terrible mistake. "I've written letters to all of you over the years," he said near the end. "Letters I never sent because I was too afraid. But I want you to have them now. I want you to know that not a day has passed when I haven't thought about what I did, when I haven't wished I could take it back." As the meeting ended, something unexpected happened. Rebecca stood up from her chair and walked over to where Jonas sat in his wheelchair. For a moment, Sarah thought she might strike him, might finally give voice to the rage that had been building for decades. Instead, Rebecca placed her hand on Jonas's shoulder and spoke in a voice that was somehow both broken and strong. "I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I need to. I've carried this anger for too long, and it's time to let it go." Samuel couldn't bring himself to offer forgiveness, but he did something that was, perhaps, more important. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wooden horse, intricately carved from a piece of cherry wood. "I made this for Mary," he said, placing it in Jonas's hands. "I've been making things for her for 43 years, trying to give her the childhood she never got to have. I want you to have it, to remember her the way she should have been remembered." Jonas died 6 days later, on a Sunday morning when the autumn sun was streaming through the windows of Sunset Manor. His last words, according to the nurse who was with him, were, "Tell them I'm sorry." Sarah arranged for his body to be cremated and his ashes scattered in the woods behind the Stoltzfus barn, near the tree where Mary had been buried. The funeral for Mary Lapp took place on a crisp December morning, 43 years after her death. The entire Miller's Hollow community turned out, along with hundreds of people from across Lancaster County who had been touched by the story of the missing children. Sarah stood at the back of the crowd, watching as the small casket was lowered into the ground in the Amish cemetery where Mary should have been buried as a child. Rebecca and Samuel had both chosen to attend, standing together for the first time since they were children. They had begun the process of healing, of reclaiming the parts of themselves that had been lost in Jonas Stoltzfus's barn. It would take time, perhaps years, but they had finally broken the silence that had imprisoned them for so long. Anna Lapp spoke at the graveside service, her words carrying across the gathered crowd like a prayer. "Mary was taken from us too soon, but she was never forgotten. She has been in our hearts and in our prayers every day for 43 years. Now she can finally rest in peace, and we can begin to heal." As the service ended and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself standing alone beside the small grave. The headstone was simple, carved from local limestone in the Amish tradition. It read simply, Mary Lapp, 1975 to 1981, beloved daughter and sister. Finally home. Sarah placed a single white rose on the grave, thinking about the long journey that had brought them all to this moment. The case was closed, the truth finally told, but the ripple effects would continue for years to come. There would be books written, documentaries made, lessons learned about the importance of speaking up and the danger of secrets kept too long. But for now, in this quiet cemetery surrounded by the fields and farms of Lancaster County, there was peace. Mary Lapp was home, and the children who had survived her death were finally free to live their lives without the burden of silence. It wasn't the ending Sarah had hoped for when she first began investigating the case, but it was an ending that honored the truth and the memory of all those who had been affected by one boy's terrible choice. The anonymous letter had been right. The truth had needed to come out before it was too late. And in the end, despite all the pain and loss, the truth had set them all free. In the months that followed, Sarah would often think about the case and the lessons it had taught her about the nature of justice and redemption. She had learned that sometimes the most important investigations aren't about punishment, but about understanding, about giving voice to the voiceless and peace to the restless dead. The Miller's Hollow Schoolhouse still stands today, converted into a museum that tells the story of the 3 children who vanished one September morning in 1981. Visitors can see the classroom where Rebecca, Samuel, and Mary took their last lessons, and they can read the full account of what happened to them in the days that followed. Sarah retired from the Lancaster County Sheriff's Department 2 years after solving the case, but she never forgot the lessons she learned in that dusty barn and that quiet hospital room. She had spent her career seeking justice for the dead, but Jonas Stoltzfus had taught her something more important. Sometimes the living need justice too, and sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply telling the truth, no matter how much it hurts. The case files now sit in the county archives, a complete record of a tragedy that shaped an entire community. But the real legacy of the investigation lives on in the hearts of those who were touched by it. In Rebecca's forgiveness, in Samuel's healing, in Anna's dignity, and in the peace that finally came to a little girl who had been lost for far too long. Mary Lapp's grave in the Amish cemetery is never without flowers, placed there by visitors who have heard her story and been moved by her memory. The inscription on her headstone has become a symbol of hope for other families dealing with missing children, a reminder that the truth, no matter how painful, is always worth pursuing. And sometimes, on quiet autumn afternoons when the wind blows through the cornfields around Miller's Hollow, people say you can still hear the sound of children playing, their laughter carried on the breeze like a promise that innocence, once lost, can somehow be found again.